What up, roomies? When people hear the word Vikings, they think warriors, raids, gods like Odin and Thor. And honestly, it almost feels like more mythology than actual real history. But the reality is, they were real people, real explorers, real fighters, real culture that actually shapes parts of the world that we live in today. So the question becomes, what's the facts? What's the myths? How much do we think we know about Vikings is actually true? Today, we got someone who lives and breathes this world, a Viking historian and host of Viking Legacy and Lore. We're going to break down the truth about Vikings, how powerful they really were, if they really made it to America, and what their beliefs actually look like. Stefan, welcome to Neighbors. What's going on, man?
Right on, man. Hey, it's good to be here.
It's amazing to have you on, bro. And thank you for being on because, history is one of my big fascinations, like outside of the pod and all that. So when I saw your post, I was like, "Yo, bro, I need to have him on talk about some Vikings." And I'm not too in depth with Viking culture or know the history, so this is a perfect opportunity to learn something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right on. Yep. Love
So
it.
let's start with this. Much how much of what people think they know about Vikings is actually wrong?
Yeah, so there's a couple big misunderstandings, the things that people they've heard and they think that the Viking Age is reduced down to these couple things. One is that they were just raiders and they just pillaged and plundered all over Europe. And then the
Yeah.
other is that their Norse mythology is just kind of a pantheon of gods that they made up or borrowed from the Romans or from the Greeks and all that. But it's a little more complex than that. If anything, they were people, and raiding was something that they did at times, actually a very small amount of the time. But they were traders, they were farmers, and they were settlers. And so and then the most fascinating part about the Vikings, and where I draw a lot of inspiration from, is they were adventurers. So
Yeah.
more than raiders, they went places and they risked everything to go and explore and to see how far they could go.
No, I definitely, because I've heard a couple of stories. Like, one story that really stood out to me was the story where they like dismantled the boat and like took it across like a valley or like a set of mountains, like to get from like Europe to like the Middle East or something like that.
Yep,
I'm
yep.
not,
So yeah, you're on the right track. So this is where the Vikings, most of the time we think of Vikings and Norse. And so when we say Norse, we're talking about Scandinavia. So you're talking Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Those are your main Norse countries, and they're all kind of pictured going west into England or south into France, and then Iceland and Greenland and so forth. But they were a lot that went east. And when they went east, they ended up in parts of Russia and Ukraine. And so there are two major rivers in Russia and Ukraine: the Volga, that goes from north to south, and the Dnieper, which goes from north to south in Ukraine. And so the Vikings traveled both of those rivers south. And so south takes them to the Caspian Sea, which takes them into the Middle East, and south in the Dnieper takes them into the Black Sea, which then leads them to Constantinople, which is present day Istanbul in Turkey. And so, because of the way those rivers are, there are some really rough spots. And so,
yeah.
what they learn to do is pull their boats out of the water and carry them across land further downriver to where the rapids are gone, the rocks are gone, and they put them back in the river, and then they keep sailing southward.
That's so dope. And I know that the Vikings used the long ship, right?
Yep, that's right.
So I know they're not as like bulky as like you would say like a Spanish galleon
Yep,
or like what Christopher Columbus sailed on. So like
that's right.
when they pulled the boats out of the water, did they use like logs to roll them on, or did they just straight brute force it?
Yeah, so there's no exact like clear, like here's exactly what they did every single time. But yes, I would imagine that they employed the logs. They employed animals as well. So they're going to come across local traders and settlements along those rivers, right? Because rivers are where people tend to settle first, because that's where you're going to need water to survive. There's fish, there's food, there's resources, and then animals, they all live within a certain proximity to water. So there are going to be settlements along the way. So then you can hire out and help with animals, ox, whatever, and have
Oh,
yeah. So and then carrying them as well. I mean, you've got, say 50 guys that are rowing this ship. Well, 50 guys, working together to
yeah.
carry a boat. It's doable.
Yeah, and plus, since they were all rowing, they would probably be of, physical stature to actually pull off that feat. You know what I mean?
Right, 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 right.
But before we actually get into like more history and of the Vikings, like what got you into like the Viking lore? What got you into becoming a historian?
Yeah. So, it all starts with, the origin story is an aunt who did a genealogy. And,
Nice.
and so, at first I just looked at it, okay, where's the Pomeroy name come from? Okay. And here's where it originates. And that's great. That's cool. And then every once in a while I kind of go back and I revisit and look at it. And then I started to notice like this actually goes back really far. And why? How? Because most people's genealogies, you don't trace it all the way back to Norway in the early 900s. It's so the reason why is because there are royal lineage in there, and the
Yeah.
royalty, they're the ones that have the lineage that goes way back, or the records that go way back. And so because our family was connected to a couple different prominent figures, our history goes all the way back to Norway and then down into Normandy, which is where the Pomeroys are from, and then across even to England and then on to America eventually.
No, I got you. And what made the Vikings stand out compared to like other history?
Yeah, so just I mean, one, a little bit of my roots originate in Norway, but in then in northern France and Normandy. And so, when you just start to dabble, you kind of
Yeah.
just take a peek into it, you go, wow, there's something to this. And then, I've always known that people are enamored with the Viking Age. It's like they've
Yeah.
romanticized it, and they're like, these big, strong brutes, and just, so there's something to that, but then you just keep digging and digging and digging, and and so I'm inspired again, with just being an adventurer and wanting to travel the world and see things. I saw that in them too. I think, well, maybe that's where that comes from originally, is just that desire to go and to explore and to see the world.
No, that's a big fact because we do it. I would say like with most ancient cultures, like especially with the Vikings, and I would say also with the Egyptians, we kind of romanticize like how those cultures were, and we kind of like give them more of a mythological kind of aspect to it, especially
Mhm.
because of those cultures, like with the Norse gods and all the myths behind that. People tend to gravitate towards that, especially the fact that you have things like the sagas and all that. When it came down to the sagas, right, did the Vikings actually have like a written language, or was it just the sagas that they
Right.
wrote down?
So they have had written language, a couple different language, well, different alphabets, I should say.
Yeah.
So Old Norse, and then they didn't write things down. You have some rune stones where basically big rocks that have some writing, but these are very few and far between. Some of them are just pictures and patterns and things. Others are actually words that we can take and say, okay, this is, so and so, or this was, this person must have lived here on this farm, type of a thing. But they were an oral history, oral tradition. So they're passing stories down orally. And it isn't until almost 200 years after the Viking Age ends where things are actually written down and codified. Like
Yeah.
you have a canon now of Norse mythology. And so I do an episode on that. I think it's actually coming out in a week from now. The man that preserved the Viking gods, that he took it upon himself to write down and record Viking mythology.
Okay. Actually, later on in the conversation, I'll bring this up and I want your opinion on it because I saw this clip of these two guys kind of comparing like Norse mythology with Christianity, and it was
Uh-huh.
really interesting. So we'll get into that a little later.
Right
But
on. Right on.
let um so let the roomies know actually who were the Vikings and like how prominent was their culture.
Okay. So In early Europe, you have the Saxons that settle in northeastern Europe, and then from there you have them dispersing kind of all over, and they go
Mm,
across the water, across the North Atlantic, and so then you have a group that ends up in England. They become the Anglo-Saxons, but then you have those that go up north and into Denmark, into Sweden, and to Norway, and they become what we refer to as the Norse. But they all have similar roots in Saxon, like Germany, uh, and so that's who they are. But then they become extremely prominent because they. I have some different theories on why, and I share these in the podcast. But they expand out from there because the world they live in is harsh. It's not great. It's cold, and it's not like where we live in our nice warm houses and can turn on the heater and
yeah,
survive just fine, plow the roads and get around. They lived in that world before the technology existed to
yeah,
really thrive. And so now you go to Norway and you go, wow, this is the most beautiful place on earth. But for them, the conditions were pretty harsh, and growing seasons for farming would have been very short because you
yeah.
have, during the summer, you have long days, but during the winter, there are times where you don't even see the sun at all. So that forces them to expand outward, and so they do explore more than say those in England, because why? You don't need to. We got
Yeah.
everything we need right here on our big island. And so they just explode everywhere. And then that's where the Viking Age comes to an end, and we go, well, what happened to the Vikings? Well, nothing happened to them. They just settled down. They settled into these other places where people were, and they became part of the cultures. And that's where, like for us,
Mm.
the Normans, they are a mix of those from Norway and those from France, and they blended. And at the end of the Viking Age, they're the Normans. So part France, part Norway, and they move forward with their own history.
That's so dope. So basically, like after like all the raiding and exploring, they basically settled down in different parts of Europe, and
Yep.
I don't want to say assimilated, but basically brought up those cultures as well.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, some places they assimilated, some places they have their own identity. So, yeah, like the
oh, that's
Normans are a good example. Yeah.
that's dope. And how advanced were the Vikings? Because I know they, since they were a seafaring and also a trading culture. Like I know they had more technology and more knowledge of like math and stuff than most other European countries at the time.
Yeah. So as you dig into that, you realize some like a almost like a principle of why certain cultures have different technology than others. And
Yeah,
for the Norse, it was technology out of necessity. It was survival. So if you imagine being in Norway, I mean, this is tons of coastline up and down, north and south. And then within that, you have tons of rivers and mountains and dense forests. Well, how are you supposed to travel to the next town over? If you've got to cross a fjord and then cross a mountain and then go through the woods, well, you're not. You're going to figure out a way to build a ship that can go on the open sea and go up a river. And so that's where their technology came from, is their ability to look at, like, how do we just live and how do we survive and how do we thrive? And so let's build a boat that can do it all. And so that, to me, uh, the chief cornerstone of Viking technology is the longship, because
yeah,
you have a boat that can travel upriver and across an ocean. Nobody else has that.
yeah,
And you can park it on a beach. You don't need to, have a harbor where you got to dock the thing, like, talking about the galleon
yeah.
and things like that, where you actually have to have docks and harbors and things built specifically so that it can stay in deep water. The Vikings could just maroon that thing on a beach, and then push it back into the ocean and be off.
That's so dope. So like, so when it came to like their tech, right? And I and correct me if I'm wrong. I heard that they had like certain techniques of like forging steel that it was never been able to be replicated again.
Yeah. So I don't know about that. It could be part of the mythology that surrounds the Viking Age. Because I say that because they were really into Frankish steel, which came from
Okay.
France. So that to them that was extremely valuable. And so, and even I would say during that time, that was the pinnacle of forging like weapons and swords and
Yeah.
things like that. So if a Viking could get a hold of a Frankish sword, that was like, having a
A1 for them.
Ferrari. Yeah, yeah.
That's so dope. That's so dope. So like, how was like their society? How did their society actually run? Like, how was like the casting system and everyday life for them?
Yeah. So I would say that it was very communal, and the reason for it being like that is because it was so hard to survive. So winter was not easy. You had to do it as a community.
Yeah,
Today we don't fully get. I think we understand the need for community. I think a lot of people desire community, but we're so like we can just survive on our own versus
that's true.
needing other people just to just survive. You got to trade your root vegetables for the guy that raises sheep over here to have some protein in your life. Like you got to do this
Yeah,
together. We've got everything we need by ourselves, type of thing. Even though we still know that we need people, we need community to some degree. But then, as far as hierarchy, there would always be we would call chieftains. Eventually, they had kings.
yeah,
To kind of rule and consolidate power. But most of the time, it was chieftains that were over a large area of land. And basically, what the chieftain's role was is to say, look, I will help protect you. I will be the one that coordinates soldiers, armies, things like that, so that you can live your life in relative peace and farm and be safe. But you're going to need to pay tribute. And so there was, some of that going on, and then as time advanced, as the Vikings, or we'll call them the Norse, they had to fight against others. Like I mean, you had
yeah,
Charlemagne in the south, and then you had their expansion in England. Then they saw the need for having consolidated power with a king in charge that could then kind of command the whole region and get troops from the whole region in order to go fight against a bigger enemy. But until then, it was chieftains, and they had their squabbles and their civil wars and things like that as well.
that's so dope. So like, all right. So when it comes to like warfare and stuff like that, we kind of like romanticize the Viking warriors. Like, how was like warrior lifestyle for them actually?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were every bit of what we described them. When we start getting into the actual battles and
Yeah,
warriors, the only thing that I think that we maybe get wrong sometimes is what they wore. There's
yeah,
no horned helmets. There's nothing like that. And I would also say that the dominant weapon was an axe. It was the one-handed, I can wield this axe and hack you up, and then a shield in the other hand. That was probably the typical, and then a lot of leather armor. You had metal helmets that you can see, but a little bit of a point at the top, but just very simple, nothing
yeah.
ornate. When you're fighting, it's all about what's practical, not what looks cool. So but yeah, they're farmers, and then they raided, and so a lot of times what you had was they would plant in the spring, plant their crops, and then they would raid, and then they would return, and then they would harvest their crops. And so that was kind of the window for the raiding season. It was also a little bit warmer during that time. They could cross the ocean, across the sea, and then go pillage and plunder, try to gain some silver and some wealth in the process. But yeah, I say that they were every bit as strong and big and giant compared to
Yeah,
others. Now, the misconception is that they were like 6'4" and 250
yeah,
pounds and just of muscle. They were probably average height was probably closer to about 5'9",
yeah.
but that probably still puts them about 2 inches taller than most people in Europe at that time. So on average, so obviously there's taller and shorter. But yeah, every bit is muscular. And I think part of that is due to rowing. They had the best exercise out there, right? They
Yeah,
just, they rowed across the sea, across the ocean, and these guys, they were strong. So
nah, I
that,
believe it, man.
yeah,
I believe it because it's like when you think Viking, you think about like this, you know, I don't even know, like Hulk of a person. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah,
And then it's like, you would think, yet again, height wise, like 6'4", 6'5", just the mountain from the Game of Thrones, just an
yep.
army of those kind of dudes just running at you.
Yeah.
But there's one warrior type. I don't know if you want to call it type or class, but talk to us about the berserker.
Yeah, so berserkers were, yeah, I guess a special kind of group of warriors that
Yeah,
have a reputation of being a little bit crazy. And there's some, I think, misnomers that go along with them that, they were drugged up and,
yeah.
eating
I was about to
mushrooms
ask
and
you.
like going crazy and, and I think to a certain degree, I'm a little bit torn, a little bit kind of I lean this way and then I lean this way, but as somebody that researches history, I tend to just say, all right, we're collecting clues and we're not going to, take a hard stance either way until we have definitive proof. A lot of people, they go, I want that to be true, so that's what I'm gonna, believe. So, but so there is some evidence that they, would do things, eat things that would help enrage them and maybe dull pain as well. And then
Yeah,
it had negative side effects because they might actually, be willing to, attack
so,
their own people, if their
yeah,
mind's not right. But then others, I would say that more common is these are highly trained warriors
yeah,
that did work themselves into a frenzy. And you can see this like in the NFL football where guys they're just like trying to like pump themselves up because they're about to go run into a brick wall, into
yeah.
another human being at full speed. And so they are trying to get their mind right in order to just go. And I see the berserkers as more of having that mentality.
Yeah, because the reason I asked is because when people mention the berserkers, they also mention like, them taking like certain mushrooms and like,
Hmm.
using psychedelics to get into like that frenzy state.
Yeah.
So I was really curious about that. But when it came down to it, when the Vikings used to go on their raids, right? What would they like? Would they just like take like treasures and like, like gold, silver, and like resources, or would they actually take people back with them as well?
Yeah, so that's where the more you dig, the more you realize like well, all of history is like this. Unfortunately, do tend to glamorize things, but the
Yeah,
Vikings were I don't want to say number one, but maybe number one as far as slave trade in Europe. So
okay,
and that just means that when they went places, their main target was silver. But if you can't get silver, then you take a human and you sell the human for
for
silver
sure.
somewhere else. Yeah. Yeah. Or
Oh,
they would keep them as slaves for themselves. Right. So yeah, so they were big into human trafficking, if you want to call it like that, which is, we have a very, I mean, I think we have a very good perspective on human trafficking today. Like it's
yeah,
like, no, that's not
yeah,
right.
different
And
class.
so when you look at Viking, you're like, wow, that was not good. And so then if you do realize that, then all of a sudden you go, so maybe this whole like Christianity thing coming into Scandinavia and converting Vikings to Christianity wasn't the worst thing in the world because maybe some of that slave trade and stealing humans and selling them for coin, that goes away when you start to value human life. So,
So,
yeah,
so, and you know what's crazy? I there's when it comes down to like human trafficking or like the slave trade back in those days, you really don't associate the Vikings with that a lot.
right,
Like
right.
you associate them with like raiding and pillaging, yeah, but you never really associate them with like actually being slave traders.
Right. They just wanted anything that had value. So, obviously silver is what they were after, but they were good at trading and they had trade networks, again, all the way from Norway down to Baghdad. So, I mean, they had extensive trade networks. And so you could take anything. So, fur pelts
Yeah.
from, the animals, or people, and you would take them as far as you could take them, and you'd sell them and you'd get more coin. There's tons of silver that's been found in Sweden and Norway that originates from the Middle East. So you can tell that their trade network reached that far.
And what was like their like number besides like the slave trade? What was like their number one export? I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I just did an episode on fur, on pelts, and this is maybe an earlier export, but I think it was a significant one because they had fur that you couldn't get other places, and they also, this is their livelihood, so they were good at it. And so you had different pelts, fox, beaver, and different weasels. There's one weasel that's in Eastern Europe, so along the Volga. It's called the sable,
Yeah.
and it was considered the soft gold of Europe, and they were good at getting that and trading that. I mean, it had major value, and then timber. Timber was a big one for the Norse, and then also like walrus husks when they ended up in Greenland. So they would export ivory, so things like that.
Oh, that's dope. Um, Another thing is, since we know that the Vikings, expanded, all the way from England to Istanbul, right?
Mhm.
How responsible are the Vikings for like bringing technology and like innovation into like Western Europe?
Um, I mean, I don't know that there was anything direct. I think by the time that the Vikings went where they went, there was a mutual kind of building up of society. So,
Okay.
like when the Danes settled in England, there were lots of fights, battles, things like that. So it kind of went from raiding into settling into now having territorial war, and so you're both sides are kind of growing their technology in order to farm better, but also then survive better in these attacks and fights and things like that. So I don't know that they gave anything that they didn't get in return as well. And I think just the world was developing, and I don't see anything specific that the Vikings like brought to the table other than the long ship again
Yeah,
was a big deal.
that's dope. That's dope. All right. There's a lot of debate over it, and I'm a firm believer that the Vikings did make it here way earlier than Columbus,
Mm.
and I think there's a lot of evidence for that. What's like your take on that?
Yeah, I have no doubt. The Vikings were here 500 years before Columbus. I don't think it's really disputed. Not really. So there have been things found in Canada. So this you're talking about Newfoundland, Canada, where Vikings had been there. Now they were there temporarily. It wasn't a long-term situation. So one of my favorite Vikings of the Viking Age is Leif Erikson,
Yeah.
and so he is the one that first set foot on North American territory, and took a couple trips, and one where they stayed the longest. They started to build settlements and they interacted with the locals, so your Native Americans basically, and everything was going just fine until there was a big misunderstanding. And there's a couple
Ooh.
different stories as to what was the root cause of it. But needless to say, things turned, and now all of a sudden the settlers, the Viking settlers, they were having there was tension and they were fighting against the locals, and the locals basically drove them out. So then Leif Erikson and his people, they returned to Greenland, and then Leif has a sister, a half sister,
Yeah.
who basically decides that she's going to go. And there's some epic accounts of battles, along the beach that they fight with the natives. But it didn't work, and I'll tell you the main reason why is because it was too hard to trade with the rest of Europe. So this was a financial decision
Mm,
to to quit,
mm,
because trading with the locals was no longer an option, and then the commute from North America back to Europe was too crazy,
bro-
and it wasn't worth it, right? So then it wasn't viable, and so then they just had to say, you know what, let's call it quits, and we'll stick to walrus and from Greenland to Iceland to England type of thing.
that's so dope because my thing is that if the Vikings were here 400 years before Columbus, right? Our history books are still saying, "Hey, Columbus discovered America," right? So
Right.
it's kind of weird, like knowing that another group of people came here, centuries before, and we're not really teaching that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is kind of a bummer that it's not taught. I think Columbus still gets credit. I mean, that's when the 1492 you get Columbus coming, but that's when it's like, all right, now things are going to start developing from there, right? So the Vikings landed for sure. They stayed temporarily, but they didn't move forward with that. So I think they both they at least Leif Erikson and his crew should get some credit for having ventured that far. But Columbus and what came after is what we have today, more or less.
Yeah.
The
So
pathway
it
to
would so it would be more of a like a settling thing versus a discovery thing, I would
yeah,
guess.
something like that. Yeah.
All right. When it comes to like the sagas, right? And I know the sagas are a big thing in the culture. Am I correct on that,
Yep. Yep.
or
Yep. Oh yeah.
are they more like myth and like lore versus like actual history?
Almost. Even if it's history, it's lore for sure. Like
Yeah.
everything is exaggerated to some degree. But yeah, it's a lot of stories. Yep.
Okay. Any any cool ones? Any one of your favorites?
Well, I just recorded this morning one of the sagas about Odin obtaining wisdom. So, if you're familiar with how he's depicted, like in Marvel movies, but even then, just a random picture of Odin, oftentimes you see him with an eye patch.
Yeah.
So how did he lose his eye? Was it in battle? Was it, something significant? No, he plucked it out himself, basically. And so this saga, this story, shows Odin as looking for wisdom, wanting to gain wisdom. So he travels to this well where wisdom is offered, but wisdom's not free. So he has to remove his eye in order to obtain this wisdom. And so that's one of the. It's a fascinating saga, but what I like to do is like, all right, what did this mean to the Vikings? So this is where there's tremendous value in the sagas, even though we can
Yeah.
just say they're stories that were told around a campfire, in the longhouse on the deck of the ship as they cross the ocean.
Yeah.
But what's the significance here? And I think what we see, what's unraveled for us, is that the Vikings valued something. They valued wisdom. They valued the pursuit of knowledge, and they understood that it came with a cost. It wasn't free. And so when you see that there are lessons like that in the sagas, it's like, wow, they actually mean something. So then you go, all right, what's the next saga? So we have Hrungnir. He's
Yeah.
the most epic giant of Viking lore. Okay, so he fights with Thor, and Thor kills him, and he falls dead on top of Thor and almost kills Thor in the process. But what's his story? His story is about a giant from Jotunheim, which is one of the nine
Yeah.
realms, and this place where time is irrelevant. It does not matter. Like it's going to go on forever. He's made out of stone. He's just a big rock, and he doesn't have any recollection of a beginning. He has no threat of an end. And so what is time to someone like that? What is speed to someone like that? Well,
True.
all of a sudden he has this idea of, well, what if I could move fast? What if I could move forward? What if I could explore beyond this realm? And so then he gets a horse, and it's a fast horse, the fastest animal alive, and he races Odin, and all this, and this story unfolds. And so what's the principal point behind all of that, right? And so you just dig into those stories and you say, what does it mean, and what's it mean for us? What can we take away from it today in our modern world? And I'm telling you, there are so many applications. It's crazy.
Nah, I believe it because all mythology, well, all mythology across cultures always have like this lesson to be learned. On
Hmm.
top of it being like these fascinating stories about like heroes and gods and you know giants and demons and whatnot, they always have like this key element that kind of like pushes a certain how can I say it characteristic, I would say, of the culture, or like something that that culture really like values.
Yep. Yep.
And how often do you see that like the sagas push like a value point for the Viking culture?
Yeah, all of them. I think that they're all of them are pushing some sort of value point, like what you're saying. And so, even Odin, he sacrifices his eye for wisdom. He hangs himself on a tree in order to gain the knowledge of Viking age runes, which is
Mm.
the alphabet. Um, he goes and he steals the mead of poetry, so this concoction, this brew, and he drinks it, and it's how, an explanation for the Viking Age of how poetry spread to humanity. And so, but everyone has got some sort of sacrifice involved. Everyone has something on the line, and it's just like any good story where there's something to be risked here in order to get what we're after. And so I love that the meat of poetry. We did a episode on that, and it's like I called it the greatest heist in Norse mythology, because he goes in, he's got to figure out, Ocean's 11 type of, how do I steal this mead? So it's pretty awesome.
That's dope. That's dope. You know what's crazy? And roomies, don't kill me for this one. But and this is me barely knowing anything about Vikings and like the little bit I know. The Norse are apparently the first people to actually use like rap music.
Rap music. Wow.
Yeah, yeah, because they invented flighting or flighting, something like that. And it was like
Okay.
and it was like a form of like, it was poetry, but it was like rhythmic.
Uh-huh.
It was like rap, but but for them.
Right on. Well, hey, I'm learning something today too. I'm
And
gonna
I, and I
I'll
was,
I'll look into it. That's great.
and shout out to Ubisoft for putting that in Assassin's Creed. That's actually how I learned it. And I
Ah.
was having this debate with one of my friends, and so I googled it, and I was like, oh shit, like they were spitting bars before there was bars to be spat.
Uh-huh. Nice.
Yeah, man. So
That's cool.
that's so dope. How much of mythology is based on like real beliefs?
Well, it's all I would say it's all based on real beliefs at one time. That is how they saw the world and interpreted the world. So, that's the thing. Every humanity has always been asking the same questions. Who am I? Why am I here? And what happens after I'm gone? And so, every culture is asking that question and answering that question. Okay. And that's, it's not exclusive to the North. It's not exclusive to Christianity. It's not exclusive to anywhere. It's just, it's everywhere. So they're looking at the world and they're trying to interpret. I would say that they are drawing heavily from Saxon tradition and Roman tradition from there, which then is drawing from Greek tradition. And so there's a lot of overlap and a lot of kind of, well, this is what that cultures believe. But then what you begin to see is that they are interpreting the world in a little bit of a different context. So again, the harsh environment where they lived, there's a lot of ice in their mythology, and a lot of like explanation for why the world is cold, what's going to happen at the end of the world. They have this thing called the thimble winter, which they predict is going to be 3 years long of just winter, 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 like one after another. There's no summer. And so you can start to see that their beliefs are being shaped by the world that they live in, that it's a cold, environment, harsh environment. So So they definitely believed it. It was definitely it's all gives us insight into what they thought about, lightning, about the waves, about the wind, all that type of stuff. Uh,
That's dope.
yeah, and so then things change, obviously, as people gain knowledge and science and different explanations for, oh, this is why this happens. This is then that's where the beliefs turn into mythology. But originally, they weren't mythology necessarily.
There was our explanation of the world.
Yep.
I get that. And let's talk about the gods real quick, right?
Hmm.
I know we glorify like Odin, Thor, and Loki, but who
Hmm.
I know Odin was like the father of all the Norse gods. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, I mean, he's the father. Yeah, he's in.
Or,
So the biggest distinction is there are the Asgardians,
yeah,
and the Jotnar, and so there's basically two major classifications of the gods. But the Asgardians, that's like yeah, Odin and Thor. But then you have many more beyond that. Balder, he's a fascinating god, and then you have Freya and Frigg, and you have a bunch of other gods that don't get as much attention as the ones that have shown up in comic books.
yeah. Okay, okay. And like, did did like the Vikings just did? Well, they probably did, but did the Vikings like truly believe that the gods existed at one point and were like actual beings like that walked Earth?
Yep, I think it's safe to say that they believed that. For how long and to what extent, I don't know, but th- there's definitely evidence of offerings, sacrifices. People, they tend to have like a patron god, where they, like, say the common folks,
Yeah,
they would pray to Thor. He was like their god, versus maybe the aristocrats and the wealthy, they would pray to Odin. There were gods for lots of different things: god of the sea, god of the mountains, things like that. So it could be just depending on your context as who you adopted as like the one that you would pray to more than the others.
I got you. And how did their religion sort of like shape their culture?
Well, so I mean, it gave them an explanation for everything, and then I think it's innate within humans to want to ascribe credit for success, and then also to have someone or something to go to in order to say, things aren't working the way that I expect them to, and I need help. So, whether it's a drought or a long winter and or a harvest that's not going the way you thought, and so it's the beliefs. Again, this is not unique to the
Yeah,
North. It's all in every culture. But then what you believe, and this is also not unique to them. This is for everybody. This is people today. What you believe shapes the path that you walk down. Like, there's just no way
true.
around that. So
No,
yeah.
true, true. And why do you think people, even though we know so much about the Vikings, not me like a common person, but history, we know a lot about them.
Yeah.
Why do you think people are still obsessed with Viking culture and like ancient civilizations and stuff?
Yeah, I think that it comes down to a little bit of identity, and this is something that I cover in some episodes. I've got one coming out, the 40th episode that's coming out. We'll talk a little bit about identity and how important that is. But people want to identify, to find the meaning and direction, and so who am I? Because again, that's one of those core questions that we all ask. And so we're fascinated by them because we can see a little bit of ourselves in them, or we can take and see what we admire about them, and we can say, I want to be like that. And so, I mean, I'll just be honest, that's my thing. Like, man, Leif Erikson, the reason, like, dude sailed halfway across the world in a open vessel, and discovered. And so, like, hey, I could get on a plane and go somewhere. I mean, but it's a lot safer than getting out there in the open sea. And
Yeah,
he explored, and he was brave, and he was bold. And so I want to be like that too. And so if that helps me identify with something, a characteristic, a trait, and I can kind of like make that a part of who I am, then I'm going to be better for it. And so I think that people see the Viking Age as an inspiration.
I got you. And what can like modern day people learn from the Vikings?
Say that again.
What can like modern day people learn from like Viking culture?
Well, so again, if you dig in, you're going to see opportunities for their characteristics, the core of who they were, their boldness, the adventure spirit, and you're going to say, "Oh, I want some of that." And so,
Facts.
give me some of that. Also, I'm always impressed by, man, these people. They were grinders. They were living in the harshest conditions, and they just kept on going. And so whatever we go through, it's nothing compared to that. We can do it. We can do it too. We can grind it out, and we can be inspired from the Vikings.
Nah, that's a big fact because if you think about it, we have compared to like our predecessors and our ancestors, we are pretty well off. You know, we got this level of technology. We could basically live at any part of the globe, you know, and
Hmm.
not go through the things they went through. So like when it comes down to it, you could get a lot of inspiration from like their determination, their bravery, their curiosity, especially their curiosity. Because the one thing I
Hmm.
will say about the Vikings is that they explored a lot of the world, and even though they're the big thing with, well, at least modern day society thinks that their big things was raiding and pillaging, they were curious people and they discovered a lot and explored a lot. And I
Hmm.
think that human society should keep that level of curiosity and exploration.
Yeah, yeah. Be curious for sure, for sure.
Yeah,
And
man.
they came across lots of different cultures. They were able to interact with all of them. So it is possible to, treat people respectfully and gain from every culture that you interact with. I mean, these guys, they traded and traveled to, different continents, 3 to 4 different continents. And so, they interacted with everybody, and they did it successfully, and we can too.
That's a big fact. And what's one misconception that you could clear up for everybody about the Vikings?
Hmm. Misconception. Yeah, it's going back to almost like the beginning of our conversation, is that they weren't just raiders. In fact, raiding was such a small part of what they did. It's maybe the most exciting, kind of thrilling
Yeah.
part, but they were people. They were settlers. They were farmers and traders and trappers, and they explored and then they settled. And so I would think of them more as settlers, as people that went through an expansion and exploration, because they settled in North America, they settled
Yeah.
Greenland, they settled Iceland, they settled in England, in northern France, across Europe, not to mention Norway, Sweden,
Yeah.
Denmark, some of Finland, Estonia, Poland. Like they went everywhere, and they settled. And so to me, that's more of who they are versus just raiders and pillagers, and get going after the treasure, and just beating on their chest, and throwing axes at people.
Nah, I feel you. And that's so dope. Like ancient civilizations and like especially old cultures that we don't really like. How can I say it? I don't want to say we don't understand, but we don't have all the facts for. It's super dope to like actually like be able to sit down with somebody like yourself and actually learn about it. You know what I mean? And it opens your eyes because before this conversation, I was thinking the Vikings were out here just wilding, but it's more strategic than that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Very strategic.
And and going back to like earlier in our conversation, I saw this clip, and it has to do with like Norse mythology, and I want your take on it. Right? These guys were explaining how Loki, right, tricked everybody to believing that he's like the Christian god, like he's the monotheistic god, because like Ragnarok happened, and he like tricked everybody to think that he was like one god.
Hmm.
That
Mhm.
he was the only god, in existence at that time after like
Mhm.
Ragnarok and stuff.
Well, so after Ragnarok, yeah, I mean, I haven't heard that specific theory because after Ragnarok, there is only one god, and that's Balder, which, interestingly enough, was killed by Loki, or at least it was part of Loki's plan to trick Balder's brother into killing him. And so Balder dies. And so he's one of the first Asgardians recorded that actually dies. But then he's the one that comes back after Ragnarok is over. So after the world burns, after all the gods die, then there is just one. It's Balder, and he, yeah. So then the surviving humanity, then everything kind of is rebirthed from there.
Okay, okay. I'll send you the when I find it on my Instagram. I'll send you the clip so you can check
Yeah.
it out.
Yeah, well, there's there are a lot, and and some of the ones that get the most attention are the ones that are like just out there, like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Because what happens is somebody will see it and they go, "That's not right. That's so wrong. That's," and then people comment, and then the algorithm picks it up like, "Whoa, thing is getting traction." Well, yeah, it's because they said something pretty wild.
No, and it's cool to like, and yet again, even though it's wrong, it's cool to like see people like make those connections and kind of say, hey, yo, this is a theory that I have, and like,
Yeah,
and it
yeah,
kind of lines up. It may not line up all the way, but it kind of like connects a couple of dots here and there, and it gets people thinking, and that's like
uh-huh.
one of the best things you could do, especially now that
Yeah,
we're just scrolling through shit.
yeah, sure, sure.
Yo, and Stefan, before we wrap everything up, man, thank you for being on. And I always ask all my guests this before we go. Do you have any final thoughts, words of wisdom, or messages for the roomies?
All right, so I'm gonna take from the episode that I just recorded, and basically just say that pursue wisdom, pursue wisdom like Odin pursued wisdom, and understand that wisdom oftentimes does cost something, but whatever it costs, it's always worth it. And Odin didn't hesitate to give up his eye, right? He couldn't see as well after he lost one eye, but he could see better than ever before because he gained something more valuable than just his sight, and that's wisdom. And so get after it. Search for wisdom. Knowledge is out there, it's ready to be found. So get after it.
I feel you. And roomies, remember, make sure to go check out Vikings Legacy and Lore with my dude Stefan here. I'm gonna be dropping the link in the description. But remember, stay curious. Feed your inner explorer, and be like the Vikings, respect other cultures, and learn about them. Because one day might be on the other side, and they might want to learn about you. And with that being said,
Mhm.
peace out.